The Committee on Cybersecurity, Infrastructure Protection, and Innovation, and the Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security will come to order for today's hearing, entitled Transportation Security, Protecting Planes, Trains, and Pipelines from Cyber Threats. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the subcommittees in recess at any point. Let me start by thanking Chairwoman Watson Coleman and Ranking Member Garbarino, Ranking Member Jimenez, and our panel of witnesses for joining us today. We are here to assess the administration's actions aimed at mitigating the cybersecurity challenges facing the transportation sector. Earlier this year, our subcommittees worked together to evaluate how the federal government partnered with the private sector to respond to a ransomware attack against Colonial Pipeline, which resulted in 5,500 miles of pipeline being shut down. As panic led to fuel shortages at gas stations along the East Coast and airlines scrambled to find alternative fuel supplies, we learned that one, attackers infiltrated Colonial Pipeline's business network using a legacy VPN that did not require multi-factor authentication. Two, the flow of information between Colonial Pipeline, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and the Transportation Security Administration was slow, fueled in part by ongoing confusion about which agency was in charge. And three, despite repeated offers from TSA, Colonial Pipeline had not yet undergone an important security assessment, a validated architecture design review, and did not have a disaster response plan that contemplated the full scope of cyber threats. Shocked by what we learned during their oversight of Colonial Pipeline and other recent high-profile cyber incidents, members of Congress have begun to question whether the federal government's approach to cybersecurity, which relies primarily on voluntary partnerships, actually works, or whether some security requirements ought to be mandated. The notion that certain entities should be subject to cybersecurity standard mandates is not new. Almost 10 years ago, President Obama issued Executive Order 13636 and improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity. The executive order directed sector risk management agencies to evaluate whether they had sufficient authority to establish cybersecurity requirements for critical infrastructure entities for which a, quote, cybersecurity incident could reasonably result in catastrophic regional or national effects on a public health or safety, economic security, or national security, end quote, and report back to DHS and the White House with what they found. To the best of my knowledge, no agency suggested they lacked authority to issue such requirements. Nevertheless, for nearly a decade, the federal government has continued to pursue security policies that rely primarily on voluntary partnerships with the private sector. That's why the security directives that TSA issued for pipelines and the requirements TSA plans to issue for rail, transit, and aviation deserve such careful attention. They mark a pivotal transition in the federal government's approach to cybersecurity. As a representative from Brooklyn, I welcome TSA's renewed interest in improving the cybersecurity posture of the transportation sector. New York City is a transportation hub, home to two major airports, several rail lines, and the largest mass transit system in the nation. Just 6 months ago, hackers reportedly tied to the Chinese government breached the Metropolitan Transit Authority's network. Fortunately, they did not gain access to operational systems that control rail cars, but I remain concerned about the cybersecurity of mass transit systems generally and MTA's network in particular. Given the degree to which middle and low-income people rely on public transportation, a cyber attack affecting mass transit could have a disproportionate impact on these populations. In light of the conversations I've had regarding cybersecurity threats to rail and aviation, I also support TSA's efforts to raise the bar on cybersecurity for these subsectors. That said, as the federal approach to securing critical infrastructure evolves, we must get it right. TSA's security directives on pipelines and pending security directives on transit, rail, and aviation present an opportunity to better understand the administration's security goals, how the security directives align with those goals, and the private sector's ability to effectively implement the directives. Today, I hope to identify the lessons learned from the rollout and implementation of the pipeline security directives so we can use them to inform future transportation security directives to ensure that they are buying down risk and yielding the security benefits we expect. More broadly, I hope today's conversation will provide insight into how we can raise the cybersecurity posture across critical infrastructure sectors. I thank the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Cybersecurity, Infrastructure Protection, and Innovation, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Clark and Chairwoman Watson-Coleman for holding this important hearing today. And thank you to my colleague, Ranking Member Jimenez, for his continued leadership on transportation security. As you know, cybersecurity remains a bipartisan cooperation in Congress. Bringing together these two subcommittees is a continuation of the bipartisan spirit that makes this community function so well. But there remains room for improvement. This year, the full committee and our cybersecurity subcommittee have held several hearings in the aftermath of major cyber incidents to review the state of our nation's cyber preparedness and assess the overall efficacy of response mechanisms across the federal government and within various industry sectors. This joint hearing is a great opportunity to continue that work, focusing on the transportation sector, which impacts millions of Americans and many of my constituents. Every day, Americans are already experiencing the impact of a pervasive supply chain crisis. Goods are becoming more expensive and harder to find. Nearly every sector of our economy has been affected by this problem, which is particularly acute in the auto industry. We've already witnessed the impact of a devastating ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline, which led to gas shortages on the East Coast. Imagine a similar attack on a major U.S. port, airline, or major logistics company as the holidays approach. We must ensure that there's a robust partnership between the Department of Homeland Security, particularly the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, the Transportation Security Agency, and the U.S. Coast Guard, and the owners and operators of our transportation systems. I hope that this hearing reviews the cyber preparedness of our critical transportation systems and how agencies like CISA, TSA, and the Coast Guard can enhance their programs, services, and guidance to best ensure entities can defend and mitigate the threat of cyber attacks. I'm particularly interested in learning more about DHS's use of security directives as a tool for enforcing new security standards. I would like to hear testimony and learn from our witnesses regarding the impact of security directives and how TSA is working with relevant partners to ensure robust industry input because they know their sector best. I'd also like to hear from our witnesses on the extent to which industry expertise and feedback is utilized in the creation of these security directives. Members of this committee, including myself, are actively engaged in crafting mandatory cyber incident reporting legislation to improve CISA's visibility into cyber incidents impacting our nation's critical infrastructure. I thank Chairwoman Clark for her leadership and partnership on this effort. I've also been working closely with Ranking Member Katko and Representative Spanberger to introduce bipartisan legislation to authorize the director of CISA to establish a stakeholder-driven, transparent process for identifying the owners and operators of our nation's most critical infrastructure, known as seismically important critical infrastructure. How can we expect CISA and other sector risk management agencies to prioritize limited services if we don't know what is most critical? It is also incumbent on Congress to ensure such a program includes the appropriate guardrails, guidance, and built-in mechanisms for industry collaboration. Such an important program must be done right. I believe that securing systemically important critical infrastructure strives these very principles. I'm disappointed that the committee held a markup this morning. This legislation was not included, despite months of industry collaboration and attempts to collaborate with the majority. I hope it comes soon. I do want to note Representative Langevin's leadership on this important issue and his transparency with the minority. I look forward to working with him and with you, Chairwoman Clark, on this legislation to continue the bipartisan nature of our subcommittee. Lastly, I'll just say that the issue of transportation cybersecurity hits close to home. It was shortly after New York's MTA systems were hacked in April and discovered in June, in which Secretary Mayorkas announced intentions to create a new security directive for major rail and aviation entities. I look forward to learning from our panelists here today about what this community can do to help TSA, CISA, and the Coast Guard work towards an enhanced public-private partnership with owners and operators of our nation's transportation system. Thank you very much, Chairwoman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Garbarino. The chair now recognizes the chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security, the gentle lady from New Jersey, Ms. Bonnie Watson Coleman, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Clark, and to our ranking members, Jimenez and Garbarino. Thank you for coming together around this very important issue. And to our witnesses, thank you for being willing to discuss this critical topic. I want to be crystal clear. When it comes to transportation cybersecurity, inaction is not an option. When gas stops flowing due to a cyber attack, it doesn't just impact the pipeline owner. It means Americans struggle to fill up their tanks. If hackers succeed in bringing down a plane or derailing a train, it's not an airline or railroad that would pay the steepest price. Indeed, the real cost would be borne by the passengers injured or even killed. Simply put, when you own critical infrastructure, people's lives and livelihoods depend on your cybersecurity. Yet despite the stakes, most transportation operators currently have no obligation to meet even baseline cybersecurity standards. The status quo is dangerous. We're all familiar with the attack on Colonial Pipeline, but just this year, hackers have also targeted New York's MTA, as stated, the Massachusetts ferry system, the Port of Houston, one of the largest depositories of airline passenger records, a leading pipeline maintenance company, and global freight railroads, and the list goes on. Unquestionably, our nation's transportation systems are facing a crisis. Fortunately, TSA has begun the process of requiring critical operators to take basic cybersecurity precautions. The recent cybersecurity directives for pipelines and Secretary Mayorkas' announcement of forthcoming requirements for rail, transit, and aviation are justified, necessary, and an important first step. But more action is even needed. For instance, TSA must ensure all transportation modes are covered. Particularly as vehicles become increasingly connected and autonomous, the cybersecurity of motor carriers and buses cannot be forgotten. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard needs to hold ferries, ports, and other maritime systems to similar standards. There's also the question of implementation and enforcement. If an operator proposes an alternative procedure that maintains robust cybersecurity, TSA needs to provide timely, substantive feedback. By the same token, if operators fail to comply, leaving our nation's critical infrastructure vulnerable to attack, TSA must have the resources to enforce the rules. And ultimately, TSA should pursue traditional notice and comment regulations so that stakeholders can offer meaningful input. But these conversations around implementation shouldn't distract from a fundamental fact. There's no substitute for mandatory transportation cybersecurity requirements like those that are announced by TSA and Secretary Mayorkas. While many operators employ best practices, invest in cybersecurity talent, and coordinate with government voluntarily, some cut corners and put us all at risk. Without requirements, there's nothing to compel those companies to improve. That's a prospect we cannot take lightly, because in the 21st century, Physical security and cybersecurity are two sides of the same coin. Historically, to hijack a plane, you had to clear TSA's checkpoint and then breach the cockpit. Today, it may be possible to hijack a plane by hacking it. The same is true for railroads, subways, and other modes. Cameras and guards are no match for a hacker seeking to control or derail a train. This isn't science fiction. This is the future. And cybersecurity requirements for all modes are the way to prepare for it, as well as tackle today's immediate threats, such as ransomware and state-sponsored data theft. A recent study found that only 60% of transit agencies have a cybersecurity preparedness program in place. And the surge in cyber attacks against railroads, airlines, airports, and maritime assets suggests an equally grim picture in these modes. This is our moment to ensure that every transportation operator in America prepares themselves for 21st century threats. We can't wait until a hacked plane falls from the sky or a breached railroad gridlocks our nation's supply chain to take action. I look forward to hearing from our panel today about what can be done to shore up the cyber defenses of our transportation system. Again, I thank the witnesses for joining us, and Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady from New Jersey. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Clark and Watson Coleman, for holding this important hearing today. And to Ranking Member Garbarino as well, I'm glad that we can bring these two subcommittees together to discuss how to protect our vital aviation, surface, transportation, and maritime systems from cyber threats. I know firsthand from my time as mayor of Miami-Dade County how important these systems are to the flow of people and goods and the overall health of our economy. As we're seeing right now with supply chain challenges and the increasing prices in everyday goods, keeping our transportation system operating at a high level is imperative. The recent ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline only served to highlight what owners and operators of these critical infrastructure systems already knew. A significant cyber incident has enormous ramifications to their systems and can cripple the goods and services that our nation needs. Transportation system owners and operators have enhanced their cybersecurity practices and real-time information sharing over the years. But there's always more that can be done to strengthen our defenses, and it's imperative that we do so. As TSA moves forward with new cybersecurity directives for aviation, rail, and mass transit in the next few weeks, it's important that industry is fully consulted as these requirements are drafted and implemented. The owners and operators know their systems the best and what is workable. Having a strong public-private partnership as new cyber requirements are imposed in the transportation sector is key. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today on their perspectives on how to strengthen cybersecurity throughout our transportation system. And Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
I thank the ranking member from Florida, the gentleman, Mr. Jimenez, for his statement. And members are also reminded that the committees will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in their February 3rd colloquy regarding remote procedures. I now welcome our panel of witnesses. Ms. Suzanne Spalding is a senior advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and before that, Ms. Spalding served as the Undersecretary for the Department of Homeland Security's National Protection and Programs Directorate, which Congress redesignated as CISA in 2018. Next, we have Ms. Patricia Cogswell, a senior strategic advisor for the National Security at Guidehouse, who served as the Deputy Administrator for the Transportation Security Administration from 2018 through 2020. I would also like to welcome Mr. Jeffrey Troy, the President and CEO of the Aviation Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or the Aviation ISAC. Prior to the Aviation ISAC, Mr. Troy served as a Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI's Cyber Division. Finally, we will hear from Mr. Scott Dickerson, the Executive Director of the Maritime Transportation System Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or the MTS ISAC. Without objection, the witness's full statements will be inserted in the record. I now ask each witness to summarize her or his statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Ms. Spalding. Ms. Spalding, I think you have to unmute.
Madam Chairwoman, can you hear me at this point?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. All right. Thank you. Chairwomen, ranking members, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify today in this joint hearing on TSA directives aimed at ensuring the security and resilience of the aviation, rail, and pipeline sectors against significant cyber incidents. As the former Undersecretary at the Department of Homeland Security, where I led what is now called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and as a member of the congressionally created Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and even going back to my involvement with the Commission on Cybersecurity for the 44th President, which was run out of my current organization, CSIS, I have always favored voluntary market-based solutions to cybersecurity, as they are generally more efficient and flexible. However, I have reluctantly had to conclude that we cannot rely upon markets alone to ensure the continuity of nationally critical functions upon which the American public relies. First, the purely voluntary approach simply has not gotten us to where we need to be, despite decades of effort. The threat is evolving much more quickly than our defense. Even in these key sectors where there's been significant progress on cyber, there is still a need to ensure continued investment across all vital assets. And even in a perfect market, there are external impacts on society and the nation from inadequate cybersecurity that will simply not be captured in a business's bottom line or their calculation of return on investment. Externalities have long justified regulation and mandates, such as with pollution and highway safety. This is the thinking behind a number of recommendations from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. First, we looked at ways to improve the performance of relevant markets, including by providing better market incentives, greater transparency, more information, to improve the cybersecurity behavior of firms. But the Solarium Commission, too, ultimately concluded that the market alone was not going to be sufficient to provide the level of security and resilience that's urgently needed for the most important elements of our infrastructure, particularly what the Solarium calls systemically important critical infrastructure. We recommended creating a transparent methodology for identifying these most critical systems and assets, and then building a closer relationship between the federal government and the firms that own and operate these systems. The government should offer a suite of benefits like improved intelligence sharing and operational support, but industry should also accept burdens like requirements for security behavior and enhanced incident reporting. Consistent with this thinking, I believe it is appropriate for TSA to use its existing authority to put basic requirements in place for the most critical assets in these three sectors. The details will be important, but as described, these directives seem like a step in the right direction. Collaboration with industry will continue to be an imperative as TSA further develops these directives and perhaps follow-on regulations. Industry has a level of expertise that will be essential in understanding what needs to be done. It must be at the table to help craft directives that are ambitious but achievable, and government must invite them early enough in the process to allow them to make a meaningful contribution. In addition, those who depend upon these critical sectors should also make their voices heard in this process. Moreover, requirements should be informed by an awareness of the tools and technologies that are available to help these asset owners and operators gain visibility into their information technology and operational technology systems, detect malicious activity, and respond quickly and effectively. To encourage continued innovation in this area, government should lean towards open, performance-based standards that are technology neutral and vendor agnostic. And any new regulations should draw on existing guidelines, standards, and best practices. They should be harmonized with requirements in other sectors, particularly as between pipeline and electric sectors, for which there's often significant overlap. Finally, Congress needs to ensure that DHS has provided the resources necessary to effectively implement and monitor these mandates and continue its equally important voluntary work. Time is not on our side. The threat environment grows more dangerous with each passing day. We should not wait for a tragedy caused by malicious cyber activity in one of these vital sectors before we take necessary action. The proposed TSA directives reflect a growing body of evidence that the risk of serious disruptions to critical infrastructure is not potential or in the future. It is here now, and it requires an urgent response. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
We thank you for your testimony, Ms. Spalding. I now recognize Ms. Cogswell to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Clark, Chairwoman Watson-Coleman, Ranking Member Garbarino, and Ranking Member Jimenez, and the distinguished members of the subcommittees. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you this afternoon on transportation cybersecurity. The insights I will share today are informed by my 24 years of federal service, serving in varied capacities from the founding of DHS through my retirement as the Deputy Administrator of the Transportation Security Administration. My first significant engagement in countering cybersecurity threats to industrial control systems was while I served as the Special Assistant to the President for Transborder Security at the National Security Council after the 2012 cyber attack on Saudi Aramco. Since that time, I've seen the number of security threats increase, with an expanding number and type of threat actors, including both state and non-state actors, such as transnational criminal entities, an increased focus by them on exploiting network-connected ICS vulnerabilities, and an increasing level of risk faced across our transportation infrastructure for both the combination of increased threat, but also of consequence, as we see how an attack on one entity can affect the entire sector. I've also seen very strong partnerships across government and industry to develop tools, programs, information sharing mechanisms, and standards to mitigate the risk, including the NIST framework, TSA's pipeline security guidelines, and various multi-entity exercises. I am pleased to be able to be here today and hope that I can assist you as you consider how best Congress can support and enable transportation cyber security. I thank you for your willingness to call attention to this incredibly important topic, and I want to recognize the work that this committee, along with Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs and the Defense Armed Services Committee, are leading to promote and standardize cyber incident reporting. As this committee further examines roles, responsibilities, and activities, I'd highlight the following. First is the value of TSA's authority to issue security directives. Security directives have repeatedly demonstrated their value, providing a mechanism for TSA and industry to put immediate protective mitigation measures in place. And they send a clear message to our adversaries, to the American people, and to our allies. After the recent pipeline ransomware event, TSA's security directives were the tool of choice. SDs are most effective, as you have noted, when TSA and the regulated industry are able to work together throughout the entire process, from development of requirement through implementation. Second, promote bidirectional partnership through analysis of reporting data. As I've spoken with industry and government about the new cyber requirements, several colleagues expressed their interest in using this reporting to promote a deeper understanding of and engagement around cyber threats to critical infrastructure. There's a recognition that analyzing the threats and vulnerabilities associated with industrial control systems can tell us more about the prevalence and use of tactics, the effectiveness of measures to counter those tactics, and best practices to follow. Continued investment in open standards development. NIST and DHS, through CISA and TSA, have established cybersecurity and standards environments for ICS and critical infrastructure. Continued evolution that provides transportation owners and operators with an opportunity to participate in that development, and a mechanism to communicate direction to solutions developers and providers should be encouraged. And finally, incentivizing and encouraging innovative approaches while requiring transportation operators to achieve minimum standards. As DHS looks to advance regulatory requirements for transportation operators, I anticipate it will look to adopt a set of baseline requirements based on current best practices and recommendations, with the aim of continuing to update them over time. DHS and Congress should consider innovative mechanisms for how to achieve these goals, using a model that emphasizes performance-based outcomes and allows industry to use alternative methods to reach compliance. This can be further encouraged through a regulatory model where transportation operators can use a qualified third party to complete the cybersecurity architecture reviews or planning required, similar to TSA's third-party K9 program, and providing operators with access to a list of qualified entities who can provide such functions and services, such as GSA does for identity management and credentials, or providing other recognized criteria. Cybersecurity, it is often said, is a team sport. Having many players on the field with standards-based interoperable solutions will enable innovation and enhance the protection of our critical infrastructure. As you consider statutory language, I would encourage you to develop it in a way that will create an enduring framework that supports the evolution of cybersecurity as the threats and risks continue to change. The technology-neutral approach based on open standards that promote competition, innovation, and interoperability should be the core of such effort. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify before you today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Cogswell, for your testimony. Members should know that votes have been called, but we will continue to receive testimony from our final two witnesses today. And so I now recognize Mr. Troy to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, Chairwoman and ranking members and members of the committee. Good afternoon. My name is Jeffrey Troy. I'm president of the Aviation Information Sharing and Analysis Center. The Aviation ISAC is a global nonprofit. Our members are on 5 continents and include airframers, airlines, airports, air navigation service providers, and more. Our mission is to make the aviation industry more resilient to cyber attacks. Last time I came before you was in September of 2018, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you once again about the cyber risk landscape in aviation. The cyber risks to the aviation industry have increased. Together, both private industry and the public sector have significantly increased cooperation in threat intelligence and best practices sharing. And now's the time for industry and government to partner even more closely in creating and enhancing effective cyber risk reduction frameworks. Over the past several years, ransomware has become a common term in aviation and many other sectors. The success of ransomware operators to extort money from their victims has greatly increased the level of skill and the number of persons willing to conduct ransomware attacks. The second stage ransomware events, wherein additional ransoms are sought in exchange for deletion of sensitive records stolen as a part of the ransom operation, also highlights the risk, the theft of intellectual property, sensitive business information, and privacy data. Ransomware can also shut down operations. This has the potential to be very impactful to the aviation industry. Ransomware, excuse me, and it also becomes more complicated in the aviation industry because many of the operational technologies are mobile. The attack on Colonial Pipeline, which has been spoken of today, and the QNX real-time operating system vulnerability are 2 examples of where a cyber attack or a vulnerability in product can have a ripple effect across many sectors. Preventing, responding to, and limiting the impact of these attacks requires a team of teams approach. Our core values include creating and maintaining partnerships with numerous government and private sector entities. The Aviation ISAC is proud to have partnered with the Aviation Cyber Initiative, a joint partnership led by DoD, FAA, and the DHS, which is in the process of transferring this tri-chair seat to the TSA. This year, the Aviation ISAC and the ACI significantly solidified our partnership by co-hosting a summit on aviation cybersecurity. We're also proud to partner with CISA. CISA is maturing well and has been put out timely, relevant guidance in direct response to recent cyber attacks on critical infrastructure and the supply chain. On 6 occasions, our intelligence was used in CISA's intelligence bulletins and intelligence information reports. Similarly, we've reached out to the TSA as they build their cybersecurity strategy and create a regulatory framework over cyber events in aviation. Our industry is also benefiting from a significant increase in cooperation between private entities. This includes the Aerospace Village, the Aerospace Industries Association, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, along with Airlines for America. The Aviation ISAC is also working with ICAO, the United Nations group, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and working with them on their aviation cybersecurity strategy and their cybersecurity action plan. We're also working several other initiatives to include secure interoperability strategies across the globe. As the U.S. considers legislation such as mandatory cyber reporting, the Aviation ISAC has been reaching out to educate stakeholders to ensure that the regulatory requirements are risk-based, achievable, cost-effective, and do not degrade the success the private sector has had in reducing cyber risk through ISACs like ours. With respect to the mandatory reporting requirements, we believe it's important that the mandatory reporting is scoped to well-defined and confirmed cyber incidents, that mandatory reporting requirements should include robust liability protections, and it's critical that Congress streamlines the federal and state reporting requirements to ensure that industry resources are used efficiently to combat malicious cyber threats, rather than customizing reports on the same incident for multiple agencies. I also believe the reporting program should encourage cooperation and strengthen trust between the public and private sectors, which would include bidirectional information sharing. Information reported to the government needs to be properly aggregated, anonymized, analyzed, and shared with industry to help prevent future incidents. Thank you again for the opportunity to come before you today and work on this important matter of cybersecurity in aviation.
Thank you, Mr. Troy, for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Dickerson, to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwomen, ranking members, and members of the subcommittees. My name is Scott Dickerson, and I serve as the Executive Director of the nonprofit Maritime Transportation System Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the MTS ISAC. And a decade ago, helped create the Coast Guard Cyber Command before serving in other civilian roles and supporting private sector cybersecurity programs. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the subcommittees today. The MTS ISAC is made up of public and private sector stakeholders, including port authorities, vessel and terminal owners and operators, cruise lines, energy facilities, ferry operators, and other members of the maritime community. We focus on actionable, relevant, and timely cyber threat information sharing. We have supported cybersecurity guidelines on board vessels, as well as cybersecurity guidelines for ports and port facilities, both of which are recognized by the UN's International Maritime Organization. Our efforts have resulted in significantly more cybersecurity advisories being distributed to our maritime community than those released by the 20+ federal government organizations with a responsibility for maritime security combined. A key reason for the level of sharing we see is the anonymization of identities and the trust that this reinforces with the maritime community. Others may tell you we need billions of dollars in cybersecurity investment across the critical infrastructure sectors. We do need investment, but taxpayers may currently be overpaying for the results the critical infrastructure community is receiving from the federal government. I want to share with you 3 common challenges I regularly hear from industry stakeholders related to the federal government's approach to cybersecurity and public-private partnership. First is the concern of redundant federal cybersecurity efforts. Because of the critical intermodal connections that ports, terminals, and a variety of facilities have, some of our stakeholders are subject to multiple regulatory requirements, including the Maritime Transportation Security Act of 2002, as well as TSA's pipeline and soon-to-be finalized rail security directives. As a result, limited resources are often spent on redundant checklists, meetings, reports, audits, etc., as opposed to actively managing cyber risks to critical infrastructure. It seems like every time we turn around, there's a new effort unveiled by a government agency, or and often it seems to be repackaging the elements of an older program with a new name. The latest example is JCDC, elements of which have been in place for several years. Second, there is a lack of trust with the federal government related to cyber incident reporting. Trust is critical when fostering collaboration and information sharing. The maritime community's trust in federal agencies was yet again recently shaken in the aftermath of an incident at a port. This is because of three things. One, immediately following the incident, the three federal government agencies involved did not want industry sharing actionable information for almost 3 weeks as zero-day vulnerabilities were actively being exploited. Of note, during this 3-week period, none of those agencies collaborated with the MTS ISAC or the maritime industry writ large. Number two, CISA publicly released the name of the victim with no prior coordination or notice to the victim. This may have been in violation of the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015 and undermined trust. 3, a government agency for official use only technical report with details surrounding the incident was leaked to the press, but it was not shared amongst maritime community members. These were 3 distinct ways industry trust was undermined with just this one incident. And unfortunately, incidents are occurring regularly. Third, resource investments in people are needed. Experienced cybersecurity specialists are in short supply in all industries. Please review opportunities for partnering with ISACs for real-world, hands-on cybersecurity training, internships, and educational opportunities. Also, federal employees need to better understand the various cybersecurity funding opportunities the government provides to align with their agency mission sets. As an example, cybersecurity was the highest stated priority for FEMA's 2020 Port Security Grant Program. Yet many stakeholder requests for cybersecurity investments were turned down by U.S. Coast Guard captains of the port, resulting in only about 12% of the $100 million program being invested in cybersecurity, the number one priority. The MTS ISAC and its stakeholders are hopeful that we can more effectively partner with the federal government to safeguard our national interests. I kindly request you include, support, and protect the mechanisms safeguarding trusted, anonymous information sharing, incident reporting, and other critical infrastructure cybersecurity efforts performed by ISACs and their communities in legislation. Of note, CISA of 2015 remains significantly underutilized. Although it has been implemented, there remains resistance to fully trusting and using the provisions of the legislation. Perhaps we should focus on some of these underutilized efforts rather than creating some new ones. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide this testimony, and I look forward to your questions.
I thank you, Mr. Dickerson, for your testimony here today, and I thank all of our witnesses for their testimony. Pursuant to today's order, the chair declares the committees in recess, subject to the call of the chair. Members will be given notification prior to reconvening after votes. let me first of all thank all of our witnesses for your indulgence today. It's just so happened that we had one of those rare or common conflicts of having votes in the middle of our hearing. So I truly appreciate your willingness to remain tuned in, and we will move forward now with questioning. I will remind the subcommittees that we will each have 5 minutes to question the panel. I will now recognize myself for questions. And my first question is directed to Ms. Spalding. Ms. Spalding, for many years, the federal government has relied on voluntary partnerships and programs to improve cybersecurity for critical infrastructure. Recent cyber attacks like Colonial Pipeline have forced a new conversation about whether that voluntary partnership model is sufficient for today's threat landscape. As the former Undersecretary for CISA's predecessor organization, could you talk about the limitations of the voluntary framework and the challenge of regulation in an area as dynamic as cybersecurity?
Absolutely, Madam Chairwoman, thank you. Both your points are very well taken. We are in a situation now where we have both the capability, I think we've reached a level of maturity in government and in industry in understanding some of the basic things that really must be done and can be done to significantly raise the level of cybersecurity. And so we're in a better position than we have been in the past in knowing what kinds of mandates to put in place. So that's one thing. And then we do have a threat environment that continues to grow more and more grave with each passing day. And there is lots of evidence of this. We don't have access to the intelligence that the government or TSA may have, although I think that TSA has briefed some of the companies about the intelligence that they're seeing. That gives them that sense of urgency. But even with what we see in open source in the media every day, it's very clear that our adversaries are very focused on our industrial control systems, on operational technology, and understanding that so that they can be in a position to disrupt it, and that criminal gangs are getting increasingly brazen in their targets with respect to ransomware, for example. So the urgency is great.
Yes, so in your testimony, you mentioned that your thinking had changed about the need to move from a voluntary to regulatory framework. What role do you see CISA playing as the longtime voluntary partner and civilian hub for cyber expertise in this shift?
Yeah, so CISA ought to be, for example, the repository of mandatory reporting information that comes in. We need to have a place in government that takes that information and adds value to it. It makes sure that it's anonymous, but that it is analyzed, put in context, and then shared broadly, very quickly, so that everyone can use that information to better defend their networks. CISA brings a couple decades now of expertise on cybersecurity and on these infrastructure sectors, and work in close collaboration with sector-specific agencies like TSA can really leverage that cybersecurity expertise to help the sector experts to find the right path forward in close collaboration and partnership with industry.
So this is to all of our witnesses, and I only have a minute and some change left. So if I don't get to you, if you would just submit something to us in writing, that'll be helpful as well. But many of you mentioned the importance of mandatory cyber incident reporting as a way to grow visibility around cyber threats and improve the quality of bi-directional information sharing with the private sector. As you know, this is a top priority of mine. Ms. Spalding, if a mandatory cyber incident reporting regime had been in place at CISA since you were Undersecretary, what security gains might have been made since that time?
So two things I would point to. That information can be shared more broadly so that all network defenders have a better sense of the tactics, techniques, and procedures they're defending against. And two, it would help to calculate a return on security investment so that CISOs at companies all across the country can make the case more effectively for that investment. So I do believe it would have raised our cybersecurity posture.
Ms. Cogswell, can you elaborate on how cyber incident reporting could be used to improve security for industrial control systems across sectors?
One of the most important things I have seen is that ability to bring information like mandatory cyber reporting information with your industry experts, and to be able to use and engage with that information in a way that helps you propose the next level of solutions. The additional reporting, the ability to see how it operates in one area, how therefore it might appear in another area in advance of that area being a target, can be really quite powerful. I have seen a lot of really great work when you have government and industry sitting together engaging with that type of data.
Thank you very much. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Garbarino, of the Subcommittee on Cybersecurity, Infrastructure, and Innovation, the gentleman from New York, for questions at this time.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you to the people testifying today, the witnesses. My first question is for Mr. Dickerson. Can you please discuss the unique complications of the maritime environment and how ports must often comply with multiple regulations and requirements from the Coast Guard, TSA, and others? Can you describe some of the specific challenges when it comes to securing ports?
Thank you, Congressman Garbarino, for that question. It is a highly complex environment where, because of the intermodal aspects of the maritime sector, you will have port authorities, for example, owning the last mile of rail. And so then they need to comply with TSA's upcoming rail security directive. Similarly, they will also own pipelines. So now it becomes a question of, okay, are we reporting this information to TSA, to US Coast Guard, CISA? Do we need to involve FBI? Some of these might require CBP reporting due to goods coming into the ports. It becomes a mesh of federal agencies that then need that required reporting. And again, as I mentioned earlier in my testimony, that can lead to a lot of redundant efforts and really pulling the cyber defenders away from incident response to now answering multiple questions from multiple agencies at a time when they really need to be focused on those response actions.
Okay, so maybe for you and all the panelists, so what recommendations in detail would you have to better harmonize these requirements?
I think one of the things,
and that it works, so it's not just so that it works with industry, so it's not a high burden on industry, but still sets a high cybersecurity standard.
Right. And so I think part of the question is there a centralized point belly button for that reporting? And if that is formerly the NCIC, now the SIOC, CISA Central, and you have representatives from those agencies there, or do you have CISA representatives at those agencies? I think there's options for either way to then correlate some of that information, make sure it gets to all of the right agencies and partners, but then you're not having to report the same information, answer the same questions over and over, if that helps, sir.
Nope, that does. Anything else from any other panelists? Or I can go to my next question. Anybody want to add anything? All right. If nothing, this is pretty much for everybody, so jump in when you want. As the federal government sets the standards for industrial control systems, cybersecurity, in collaboration with the critical infrastructure community, there will inevitably be requirements for companies to validate the controls in place, as we saw in the TSA security directive. What's the most effective way to, in a scalable manner, have these validations take place? Should TSA conduct them, CISA, or can DHS, TSA, and the industry agree on what comprises a cybersecurity validation and have private companies do it? And whoever wants to jump in first, if you have.
I'll be happy to start. I will say that I think this is an environment where there are a number of opportunities to engage across the board. As you noted, there are existing protocols by which TSA and CISA partner for the validated architecture reviews, but at the same time, there are models under which regulatorily you can create the opportunity for third-party entities who are an often approved list, clearly qualified and found to be to meet various standards, who can also perform those types of services. As I noted in my opening statement, one such model that TSA has actually used before is the third-party canine program, where they create an approved list of canine operators who can be used in screening operations. They therefore can regulate both the entity that is providing the service as well as the entity who is using it to make sure that the goals and outcomes are reaching everybody's desired end state. This is an area I think that should be explored. I think there's huge opportunity, frankly, to expand the number of entities who can participate, which helps all of us so that you're not worried so much about necessarily limited resources at any one point. Or frankly, every company not having to come up to speed on every nuance of cyber, which may be more difficult given the difficulties in hiring cyber talent these days in particular.
Yeah, difficulties and expense. Okay, I appreciate it. So it'd be better off doing a third party. I appreciate your answer. And if nobody else has anything else back, I do yield. If has anything else to say, I do yield back to the chairwoman.
I thank you, Ranking Member Garbarino. I now recognize the chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security, the gentlelady from New Jersey, Ms. Watson Coleman, for her questions at this time.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you to all of our witnesses. In 2001, terrorists needed to make it onto the planes and into the cockpits in order to execute the 9/11 attack. However, in 2021, we must also consider the possibility that a terrorist or hostile nation could hijack a flight by hacking it without ever passing through TSA checkpoints or stepping foot on that plane. Mr. Troy, Ms. Spalding, and Ms. Cogswell, would you comment on this? As aircraft become increasingly connected and automated, how do we prevent hackers from hijacking planes? And in worst case scenario, if a hijacker obtained operational control, what redundancy should we have in place to ensure that a real pilot can regain control? And what role do you see TSA and CISA in concert with FAA ensuring the security of the aircraft operational control and navigational systems? I'll start with you, Mr. Troy, Ms. Spalding, and then Ms. Cogswell, please.
Thank you. Excellent question. So the aviation industry has an incredible safety record based on strong engineering design and continuous enhancement. And the aviation industry does recognize cybersecurity as a critical part of aviation safety. So the industry has an incredible safety record, and it's the result of careful incorporation of functionality and strong secure system design. And the airplane design is based on careful system integration and system isolation as appropriate and redundancy for critical systems. So safety critical systems are highly protected and hardened against attacks, but we're continuously evaluating the changing cyber threat space and trying to incorporate then improvements to anticipate threats. So the systems are separated from cyber and system engineering reasons as well. With respect to your question about a hacker obtaining operational control, as I stated above, the planes are designed with redundant systems such that if a system is not operating as designed, another system can be engaged to perform the function. And pilots are trained as well to address system failures. And ultimately, pilots are a critical layer of protection for continued safe flight and landing. With respect to the question on TSA and CISA and their roles as well as FAA, they are all stakeholders in the safety of aircraft, as are airlines and being the operators of the aircraft. These government agencies should be working with the manufacturers to obtain assurance that the aircraft, as designed, are periodically assessed against threats. These government agencies are also incredibly helpful in sharing threat intelligence information.
Thank you. Ms. Spalding?
Yeah, I can vouch from my days at DHS that the industry takes this threat very, very seriously, and that there is close interagency cooperation. Of course, DHS and FAA and DoD are all members of the Aviation Cybersecurity Initiative, working closely with industry. I do think it is something that requires constant reassessment, constant monitoring to make sure that the design basis that Jeff talks about is up to date, is keeping up with everything that we know about the nature of the threat, and that industry government collaboration continue to be very strong. This is a very dynamic field.
Thank you. Ms. Cogswell?
Thank you very much. As you know, the Transportation Security Administration actually started as part of the Department of Transportation. As such, we have very close, strong ties with the FAA and other sister entities within the Department of Transportation that continue to this day. On any given day, talk 12, 15 times, conduct regular exercises, share information on threats. I will say one of the things that I want to highlight that Suzanne noted is that continuing focus on looking at what is next on the horizon and how do we best make sure that we use our compatible authorities, safety and security, to take the best action with these threats. I will say during my time at TSA, we also worked very closely together and then with industry on those problems where we saw a nexus crossing over between the agencies. Similarly, CISA, given their membership in DHS as a strong partner from that front, proved valuable in a number of these conversations to help articulate and describe different angles against which we should be looking at that threat. I feel confident these conversations continue.
Thank you. Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Transportation, Maritime Subcommittee, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez. And let me just state that going forward, Ms. Watson-Coleman will be presiding on the balance of our hearing this afternoon. Thank you very much. And I yield to the gentleman from Florida. I assume that the gentleman from Florida has not returned as of yet. So I'm going to turn the hearing over to my colleague if she's ready at this time.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I am trying to see who is next. I believe it is Representative Jackson Lee from Texas. I'm sorry, I'm getting this information in live time.
Okay.
Representative Jackson Lee.
I think she's trying to unmute.
Thank you. The staff has to do so. Thank you, Madam Chair. We can't under the WebEx Cisco, we cannot unmute ourselves. But let me thank both of you and the ranking member for these important messages that we've been gathering today. And I'm going to ask a question of all. I think it was Mr. Troy, your testimony, I think, suggested there was a lot of layering with respect to governmental regulation and addition. And your point would be that we need to find a way to be more specific and pointed. Am I correct, Mr. Troy? Was that your testimony or Mr. Dickerson?
Congresswoman Jackson Lee, I had some comments along those lines. This is Mr. Dickerson.
Okay, so would you expand on how we can be more effective regulators first, and then I have one or two other questions, but can you quickly respond to how we can be more effective in our work? This is important work and important infrastructure that needs to be secured. So Mr. Troy?
So I believe that one of the things that's really important as we look at putting out mandatory reporting and regulations on the industry is that we use a phased approach. The phased approach basically is one that ensures that all of the people who are going to fall under these requirements can achieve the success of getting these requirements in place. And when we look at what they've done, for example, in the Department of Defense with the defense contractors, there's been, a ramp up of increased cybersecurity maturity requirements of all the defense contractors. And I think a lot of great lessons have been learned from that process. And by establishing baseline controls and then continuing to evaluate the ability of industry to meet those and then challenge them and bring them up higher is an effective process.
Let me ask, thank you so very much. And let me ask further witnesses, Ms. Spalding, I want to focus on trains in the Eastern Corridor, trains that go really into neighborhoods. And I really think that we have been on the edge of good luck, in all honesty, in terms of dealing with trains that, purposely so, they were meant to go almost up to your front door. They go behind homes, and these are interstate trains. Homes are built right on the backside of trains. They're in mountains, they're in valleys, they're in dangerous places, and they're Amtrak. What are special efforts that specifically look at trains and the cyber system dealing with ultimately, if I can use the terminology, the massive train wreck that could come from a cyber failure on our train system? There's interstate train system and obviously the commuter train. Would you care to comment on that?
Absolutely, Congresswoman. Your points about the potential risks that come with our rail system across the country is exactly right. The good news is that the rail industry has worked closely with DHS for many years. When I was the Undersecretary at DHS, the Rail Sector Coordinating Council was very active, and they have done a lot, both in the physical safety arena and security arena and cybersecurity. But as you point out, it is a complex system, and we now know what are the basic things that really need to be done across the board to protect and defend and make more resilient these critical assets and systems. And sometimes you've got to issue a mandate in order to make sure that everyone, not just those who are actively involved, but that everyone that is controlling, owning, and operating sensitive assets comes up to at least that basic standard of care. And then, very importantly, has plans in place to deal with any incident that might arise to reduce the impact and the harm to the American public and to our economy.
Thank you. Let me just quickly on the combined pipeline and planes together and just say, one of the things that we've looked at over the years is the apron, the backside of the airport, which at that time it was intrusion by uninvited guests, potential terrorists, because it was so vulnerable in the back. But they're also the apron of a cybersecurity system as it relates to flights, maybe even as it relates to the air traffic arena, but also the airlines that sort of run their own systems, and they have a cyber system now.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I'll let you finish your comment, though. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And so in the future, if you could answer the question about that backside of the airport, and then as well to tie the pipeline question into my rail question, which is pipelines are everywhere as well, and do we have the adequate cyber protection for pipelines that wind up in our backyards? And I would yield back if Madam Chair, I don't know if there's someone could answer it in a very short period. I don't know. I would welcome that. Thank you. Does anyone can answer those?
Yes, very quickly, when you mentioned the backside of the airport, it makes me think of really the operational technologies that help an airport run. And
Right.
that is a very big focus of the airlines and the airports right now, as they look at both the common suppliers to those particular types of technologies and the potential vulnerabilities as well.
Thank you, Mr. Troy. Thank you, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Thank you
I
very
now
much.
recognize Mr. Clyde of Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I appreciate that. My question is for Mr. Troy. As you well know, if the aviation sector were to experience a cyber attack, it could very well have a devastating impact on the security of our nation and our economy. So in your opinion, what is the greatest area of cyber threat in aviation? If I could have your opinion on that. Is it the airport itself? Is it I mean, you talked a little bit about the planes. I think Madam Chairwoman discussed that. And then you also have the airlines themselves with indeed their own systems. You know, any part of that could shut down air travel across the United States in various different sectors. What's your opinion? What's our greatest cyber threat when it comes to the aviation side?
That's a great question, and it's very difficult to answer because of the interconnectivity of the aviation system. It's really an ecosystem. So if I'm running an airline, I'm very concerned that if I land my planes into my hub airport and that airport can't function, that creates a problem for me. If I'm that airport, I have the same problem if all those airlines are parked at my gates and they can't move because of some function that they're unable to perform. So I'm not trying to cop out on your question, but I really think it speaks exactly to why our industry needs to work so well together because of this shared risk within supply chain and the industry segments that make up the aviation ecosystem.
Okay, and that's kind of the area I'm going to here because looking at aviation, I just see that as a you know, such a low-hanging fruit because as of yet, I have not really heard of a cyber attack on aviation that really had any effect. And you know, that's a fantastic thing, and that's wonderful. But that means it just hasn't showed up yet. And so, would any of our other witnesses want to chime in on what the aviation industry is doing, or what the greatest vulnerability might be, and how we could assist in mitigating that vulnerability?
I'm happy to sort of build on the answer that was presented, which I completely agree with. I think one of the most undervalued points that has come from all of this is understanding how an impact to one part of a system can ripple across and affect the system as a whole. And taking that information and going back into the various individual company systems and those interconnected systems and better assessing what would that look like and how do we make sure that we are quickly able to contain it and mitigate it should we see that start to occur. Not the same at all, but I'll draw a comparison to when Gatwick was actually shut down for several days because of unmanned aerial systems flying overhead. As you recall, they didn't actually harm anything, but they had periodic events where they just kept coming into the area. That clearly made it unsafe to fly, right? So they grounded all of the planes in the airport. It shut down that airport. It shut down flow to connecting airport, exactly as my colleague just said. Big ripple effects, even for something that was not actually a kinetic, physical accident or disruption that you might think of seeing otherwise. Truly important for us as a model to understand that kind of interconnected model and how we can collectively work to defend our systems.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate your comments, Ms. Cogswell. That is my great concern, and I appreciate each of you bringing your ideas to light. And with that, Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentle lady from New York, Ms. Rice, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and I'm so grateful for this hearing. Listening to this conversation brings me back to 9/11 as a New Yorker. We felt the pain of that attack very intimately. And I remember in the days and weeks and months after 9/11, which basically shut down the aviation industry for some time. And I remember wondering whether we're ever going to come back, or people ever going to feel comfortable flying again. And of course they did, but during that interim period, there was thoughts and, law enforcement that what's going to be next? Like, what the terrorists showed how they could attack us here on American soil and do it in a way that shut down an entire industry that had an enormous economic impact on our country for a long time. And I remember, talking to my friends in law enforcement in New York at that time, and they were thinking, gosh, do we have to worry about someone just walking into a mall? 3 or 4 different malls across this country. And you want to talk about shutting down day-to-day economic activity, make people afraid to even leave their homes. And I think the subject matter of today's hearing brings me to that, again, to that issue of how we get people around safely and efficiently, and all those things that our economy can hum, but we also do it in a way that keeps people safe. So, Ms. Spalding, I think it's pretty obvious why a mass transit system would be of interest to a foreign adversary. And up to this point, we haven't seen one that has had a massive safety impact. But I guess my question is, how do we, I worry about these transportation systems because some of them are run by governmental agencies and others are privately run. And so when you're looking to come up with a system of protocols to keep us safe and prevent, whether it's cyber attacks or any other kind of attack on our transportation system, how do we set up a system that can apply equally and effectively to both the public and private sector?
Yeah, it's a great question. And your point about the aviation industry in the wake of 9/11, is a reminder that of the way in which an incident, one place in one part of an industry can destroy public trust in the entire industry. And again, one of the reasons that it's in these sectors' best interest to ensure that all of the players owning and operating key assets are brought up to a baseline level of cybersecurity to protect the public trust in that entire industry. In terms of government, our critical infrastructure is, we always say, owned 85% by the private sector. Nobody knows what the exact percentage is, but that means that other percent is publicly owned. There are a number of ways in which industry and government come together. There are, for government-owned utilities as well as private sector, there is a multi-state ISAC that is for the states to come together to share best practices, including around operational technology they own. There's a government coordinating council that includes state and local and territorial and tribal governments, for governments to come together to talk about the things that they own. And all of the various sectors that have coordinating committees have a government counterpart. So the mechanisms are there, and you're absolutely right. As with every other area, we need to make sure we are harmonizing the requirements and that we're looking across these industries, regardless of who owns them, because our adversaries are doing exactly that.
Absolutely. And, I know this is going to sound like a political pitch. It really is not meant to be, but our transportation security, there is certainly a very profound cyber security aspect to it, but there's also an infrastructure aspect to it as well. Are our transportation systems as up to date and resilient and safe as they need to be? And I know my Republican colleagues on this call feel the same way that I do, that major investment in our infrastructure shows not just Americans that they should be able to travel safely and feel confident in the way that they travel around this country and around the world. But it sends a very clear message to our adversaries that we are investing in our infrastructure, and so they should beware. So thank you all so much for coming today. It's a great conversation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentlelady. I now recognize the gentleman and ranking member from Florida, Mr. Jimenez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm gonna kind of focus in on an area that has got me concerned. Mr. Dickerson, do you have off the top of your head either a correct number or maybe a guesstimate of the percentage of cranes that are utilized by U.S. ports that are made in China?
Thank you, Congressman Jimenez. I do not have that, but it's a pretty significant number for those ship-to-shore gantry cranes that we rely on to move the goods from ships to shore and vice versa.
Well, I have two concerns about that. Number one, I know that in the port of Miami, we do have some Chinese cranes, and we know that we had concerns about embedded in the software that came with the cranes, where it was malware that was meant to penetrate the port systems and do whatever it was that the Chinese wanted to do with our port operating systems. That's one concern. The other concern that I have is that whenever the Chinese want, they can cut off our supply of spare parts, which means that a significant portion of our ability to load and offload ships would be compromised if that were the case. Do you know? Do you have any thoughts on how we can mitigate the risk of infiltration into our port systems via these cranes and other either new or existing technologies that ports and infrastructure that ports need?
Thank you again, sir. I think there's a few things, and those are very valid concerns. One is the ability to be able to conduct risk assessments immediately on that equipment. So CISA has the Vulnerability Architecture Design Reviews, VADR program, but quite honestly, often that is perhaps a 12 to 18 month waiting list period before you can actually conduct that review. And in those cases, we need that equipment operational immediately upon arrival. There's not necessarily that time to waste. So then it's an opportunity to perhaps engage in, as was mentioned earlier, some pre-qualified private sector vendors that might be able to help augment CISA's functionality to conduct those reviews so that they can be done in a timely manner, and we can then identify if there's any vulnerabilities that need to be addressed.
Well, do you think that maybe we need to wean ourselves off of this dependence on Chinese technology that, again, comes from a sole source that could be our adversary? I actually believe that it's the biggest threat that we have is the ascendancy of China, that they can basically cut off our supply of spare parts and grind this country to a halt in terms of its import and export capabilities. And so in light of that, I'm going to be introducing some legislation about that. We need other sources that are either allies or friendly nations, and not so much of it coming from one source, was it China. And I understand what China did. They undercut everybody else in the world, and basically they're the sole provider of cranes around the world, which makes them, I think, it's a very, very dangerous practice and a very, very dangerous situation we have in the United States. Would you agree with that?
Yes, sir. I think there is some undercutting of the market taking place. And so having alternative sources and then being able to augment that with perhaps some grant programs that could allow then the private sector to make those investments reasonably would be helpful.
Well, fair enough. Okay, like I said, I will be introducing some legislation to try to wean us off of these Chinese cranes and other infrastructure needs from our ports that may be coming from adversary nations. And with that, my time is up, and thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentlelady from Las Vegas, Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. A very interesting.
Nevada. I'm sorry, Nevada.
Nevada.
I shouldn't be so myopic.
That's all right. We answer just about anything. So, I wanted to address this question to Ms. Spaulding. You know, in McCarran Airport in my district, Las Vegas, sees just thousands of passengers every year. Now, we're probably the only airport that's got slot machines, so a lot of them are playing slot machines, but a lot of them are working on their computers while they're waiting for their flights. And I just wonder if you would address the need for security on those airport Wi-Fi's, because a lot of personal data is being floated around that we don't know if that's safe or not. And furthermore, when they get on the plane, they use the plane's Wi-Fi. And one of the biggest complaints is when the flight attendant says our Wi-Fi is down, you can hear all the groans and the Candy Crush players and all of that. But could you address the issue of securing that kind of Wi-Fi, either in the airport or on the planes where people are connecting to it and exposing a lot of personal data?
Yes, Congresswoman, you're exactly right. We have long known that those public Wi-Fi, free public Wi-Fi availability in places like airports is completely insecure, and certainly have advised the public as best we can to be aware of that and not to use those. But realistically, they're going to continue to take advantage of the connectivity that is available to them. And though I think it's a very good point that those systems ought to be more secured. It's very difficult to have something that is open to a very transient population, right, coming and going, where you cannot use the security protocols that you can with a workforce that is more stationary. And so I don't mean to minimize the challenge, but I think it is something that we should be moving toward. And in the meantime, I hope that the public is watching and hearing how at the moment, how unsecured those networks are.
Well, thank you. I hope so too. I wish people were just reading books instead of playing computer games, but that's just my prejudice. Along those same lines, a number of the airports have vendors that take your very personal data, and we see a lot of that at McCarran's, like the pre-vetting of customers. They take eyes, you look in and you see your eyes, biometric data. And so I would think they'd need some pretty high standards of cybersecurity. I don't know if they are doing that. If you can comment on that, you and Ms. Cogswell, and how TSA is dealing with that.
So I know that Patricia will have some insights on this as well. I am familiar with some of those vendors that are providing some of that vetting before you board the plane, for example, to speed you through the lines. And they know that how absolutely vital it is that they keep that information secure. That is very personal information. And so my sense is they take cybersecurity very seriously. But I will see if Patricia has more to add.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I've actually been spending quite a bit of time on this since my departure from government, working with folks across the industry, airlines, airports, technology vendors, associations, and others about how we can encourage, frankly, an environment that holistically supports innovation for aviation passenger experience, making it, frankly, from couch to gate, a more pleasant experience, one that offers many different opportunities. You are exactly right that there is a strong recognition that we need to embed several key things along the way, one of which is that cybersecurity protection so that people feel confident and comfortable about what is happening with their data. Along with that is the press also to make sure that there is a better recognition and a better way to have these vendors tell people, what are they collecting? Who are they sending it to? Are they storing it? And how is it being used? So all of these, I think, form a core that we are hoping to continue to look to progress in this environment. There are standards that are used today. CBP has published a standard. that is used by CBP and TSA for a number of those pilots that you were talking about, where that biometric is collected and transmitted to use either for access to a lounge or to board the plane or go through security. There are also additional new emerging standards, such as the mobile driver's license recently announced by TSA and Apple, that also are coming through in these areas. Across the board, you are seeing an emphasis on that cybersecurity. I expect that to continue to evolve. And your earlier point, given that all of these are operating in that Wi-Fi connected area, that also matters, that they need to look at it as a zero trust environment where the network itself is not secure, and therefore the information needs to be secured while it's in transmission.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chairman. Maybe we can look into this.
Thank you very much. I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's good to see you. This is a question for Mr. Dickerson. Mr. Dickerson, as you may know, roughly 5.4 trillion flows through the maritime transportation system each and every year, which comprises about 25% of the United States gross domestic product. The MTS consists of an intricate network of waterways, ships, ports, and terminals, and intermodal landline connections, which allow various modes of transportation to move goods and to move people. The Coast Guard is the lead federal agency for regulation of the MTS, and it currently has the relationships, the regulatory authority, and the response capabilities to prevent and respond to threats throughout the system. So my first question for you is, how can we best use the Coast Guard's existing relationships at the port level to improve our ability to manage cyber risk with the MTS?
Thank you, Congressman Van Drew. There's a couple of things that can be done. We already have the area maritime security committees that are active in almost all of the captain of the port areas with a cybersecurity subcommittee that addresses risks. Currently, those are supported by a variety of folks with different skill levels when it comes to cybersecurity and knowledge levels at the Coast Guard level. But they're trying to hire more MTS cyber specialists into each captain of the port area, which could then support those area maritime security committees. And with those committees, you have both public and private sector stakeholders that are engaged, and they can be involved in risk planning, exercises, etc. One of the things the MTS ISAC is doing, we've formed a number of information exchanges with those local stakeholders to make sure the public and private sectors are really aware of the day-to-day cyber threat activity that is targeting them. And so that helps bridge that gap between the AMSC, which might be more at a strategic level, and the actual operational and tactical levels of cybersecurity that go on day to day. But that's definitely an area of focus that can be improved. Thanks.
Good. And I think the Coast Guard can be very essential in this entire process. And as we move on and times change and things change, so does their role. And I think this is an area we really should focus on as well. And I appreciate your answer. I have another question for you. Members of the committee have received feedback that public-private partnerships are unfortunately sometimes turning into situations in which companies do give their information, as they should, to the government, but they're not receiving anything meaningful in return. In other words, that collaboration that we want to see back and forth, I've heard, does not always exist, and it should, because this is a very larger than life foe that we have to deal with here, and we all need to work together. And I was wondering what your thoughts on that were and how we can do better with that.
Thank you, Congressman. Again, public-private partnerships are absolutely critical. Cyber is a team sport, and we all need to work together, absolutely. We need to work together cross-sector wise as well, which is why the MTS ISAC is part of the National Council of ISACs. But when it comes to partnering with the Coast Guard, yes, we have received that feedback many times. Coast Guard receives the information, but then it might be months before any information is released from the Coast Guard back to the industry community. I think closer partnerships, and I'm in multiple conversations with a number of Coast Guard leaders, and we're working on improving that public-private partnership making sure that we can mature those procedures that are in place to analyze the information, enrich it, and get it back from the government and in a more timely.
And I think they want to do that. I think there's really unexplored areas there that we can really do great things together. Coast Guard is a great agency, as you know, and I think they really can offer a great deal if we're working in tandem, if we're working in partnership. And I thank you for your answers. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Completely
Thank you,
concur, sir.
Mr.
Thank you.
Vandrew. Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have concerns that the United States for far too long has been complacent about cybersecurity. Instead of proactively securing critical infrastructure from cyber threats, the federal government is largely reacting to events. Colonial Pipeline is Exhibit A. Before the breach of Colonial Pipeline, there were virtually no rules mandating pipeline cybersecurity. Only after the Colonial breach did the TSA finally issue security directives. So as far as I'm concerned, the breach of Colonial Pipeline demonstrates that the laissez-faire approach to cybersecurity that the federal government has taken has been an abject failure. My first question is from Ms. Spalding about TSA. Instead of only issuing a security directive for each mode of transportation, should the TSA promulgate universal cybersecurity standards for all modes of critical transportation?
It's a good question, Congressman. First of all, I think the security directives are a first step from TSA, and DHS has indicated that it's very likely to move to regulations. These security directives have a limited lifespan, and within a year or so, they have to be replaced. And DHS has indicated it's likely to move to regulations. That will allow for a formal notice and comment period. I think it's really important that there be some harmonization across sectors, as a number of the witnesses have noted. That's really important, particularly for companies that have assets that cross sectors. But I think there should be room. There may be need for some specialized requirements.
If I can interject for a moment, obviously there's a need for sector-specific standards, but there are best practices in cybersecurity that all individuals and institutions should adopt in both the public and private sector, whether it's the appointment of a CISO or multi-factor authentication or software updates or password updates or contingency planning. So if those are universally agreed upon best practices in cybersecurity, why not mandate them for all operators and owners of critical transportation infrastructure?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Congressman. There's some basic cyber hygiene, we call it, that should be universal. I think the admonition that one of the witnesses made earlier to do this in a phased approach makes sense. I think identifying what DHS has indicated is they're going to start with the most critical assets. And I think that makes a lot of sense to get the government and industry to learn lessons about how to do this in terms of mandatory compliance with directives, how to monitor that, how to enforce that, mandatory reporting. But yes, you're absolutely right. There's a baseline of cybersecurity that ought to be universal.
You mentioned reporting. The policy of cyber incident reporting raises the question: what exactly qualifies as a significant cyber incident? And there's a lack of clarity about the definition. So take as an example the Colonial Pipeline. As you know, the breach of the pipeline led to the shutdown of a 5,500-mile pipeline that made up nearly half of the fuel supplies of the East Coast. It had economic effects that were felt on the ground: the closing of gas stations, panic buying, long lines. Despite those effects, the federal government did not designate the Colonial breach as a significant cyber incident. Like, in what universe does that make sense? It seems strange to me.
So the designation of a significant cyber incident is more of a signal to the government about the need for an interagency White House-led meeting to deal with the response, right? And I think there's a legitimate question about where you should set the threshold, for example, for mandatory reporting. But ransomware, it seems to me, is an easy threshold to set.
So do you agree with the federal government's decision not to designate the colonial breaches a significant cyber incident? Because I mean, that situation, I mean, did implicate a number of agencies. It even reached the attention of the president himself. So it would seem to have all the hallmarks of a significant cyber incident.
You know, Congressman, I'm inclined to agree with you. If the level of interagency meeting that was probably happening at the White House, it strikes me as probably very much the same as a significant cyber incident. I do think that should be separated from the thresholds that are set for mandatory reporting.
I just feel like we need a greater sense of urgency and more common sense when it comes to cybersecurity policy in the federal government. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Torres. I'd like to recognize Mr. Langevin from Rhode Island for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On and off the hearing, so in between other meetings. So I thank you and the other members for hosting the hearing, and I really want to thank our witnesses for their testimony. If I could start with Ms. Spalding. First of all, Ms. Spalding, I greatly appreciate your contributions to cyber and our national security writ large, both in your role at DHS and of course as one of our fellow commissioners on the Cyberspace Alerting Commission. But let me just start with this. On October 19th, several of the senators sent a letter to TSA Administrator Pekoski encouraging him to reconsider using emergency authority for new transportation cybersecurity regulations in, and I quote, the absence of an immediate threat, end quote. So I'm not sure if my colleagues were watching the news in May, but the Colonial Pipeline incident obviously disrupted the delivery of approximately half of the East Coast's fuel supply. Ransomware or other cyber intrusion against an air traffic control station or mass transit system could be equally debilitating. So I wanted to ask, if I could, do you believe TSA's new cybersecurity requirements on the rail transit and aviation industries was warranted given the imminent threats that we face?
Congressman, first, thank you for your kind words, and most importantly, thank you for your leadership over many years in cybersecurity. And it's been an honor to serve with you on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. I do believe that there is an emergency here, a sense of urgency. And we are fortunate that TSA has this authority to be able to move quickly and that it has exercised that authority. I think it's probably fair to say that on May 6th, Colonial Pipeline was not thinking that this was an urgent threat. And in fact, there are reports that they had been putting off their vulnerability architecture design review. They just weren't getting around to it. And that is the kind of, September 10th time for mindset that we're trying to avoid here. We have so much evidence of this emergency between the attacks in 2017 on safety systems that were clearly designed to be ready to inflict physical harm on people by disabling safety systems in operations. The Florida water treatment, the attack on the Florida water treatment facility, putting toxic levels of chemicals, trying to put toxic levels of chemicals into water. I think the sense of urgency should be palpable and felt by everyone by now.
Thank you, and I would agree. Let me do another line of question on third-party auditing. So again, to you, the TSA pipeline security directives require baseline cybersecurity procedures, such as reporting incidents, implementing multi-factor authentication, and developing and testing cyber contingency response plans. So in my view, these requirements are a good start, but more can and should be done. And I also believe that TSA should implement auditing of the cybersecurity controls covered entities have put in place. So an impartial third-party auditor, such as a certified private sector company or even CISA would have both the impartiality and the on-network testing personnel necessary to ensure covered entities properly implement cybersecurity controls. So from your experience and your perspective, do you believe TSA should incorporate third-party auditing into its future cybersecurity requirements, and why, if you could?
I do, Congressman. And as you point out, I mean, we have numerous other places throughout the government where third parties help to scale an effort that is put in place by the government. My colleague here today, Patricia Cogswell, has made the comparison to the third party, the role of third parties in canine certification, for example. So there is precedent for this, and I think it is an important way to scale. Our industry witnesses have talked about the need for speed in some of these certifications and for the government to do the things it needs to do, and we know that CISA's resources are stretched.
Thank you very much. I see my time's expired, so I'm not going to get to my other two questions, but maybe I can submit them for the record. One on exporting TSA regulations and others to other sectors, and the other one was on government-sponsored testing of critical technologies. So I'll submit those for the record, Madam Chair, and thank you. I'll yield back. Thank you for your answers too, Suzanne, and to all our witnesses too. Thank you. Well, Madam Chair, you're on mute.
Thank you, Mr. Langevin. Thank you very much. I want to thank the witnesses not only for your very important expert testimony, but your forbearance during our delay. Thank you. We appreciate it. And thank the members for all of their questions today. The members of the subcommittees may have additional questions, as Mr. Langevin has noted he will, for you. And we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. The chair reminds the members of the subcommittees that the committee's records will remain open for 10 days. And so with that, without objection, the subcommittees stand adjourned. Good day.